Way, Bill Daly, in the meantime, with us, the former FBI investigator. Bill, obviously, the developments overnight occurred that he took his own life. We don't know exactly when he took it. We don't know exactly what's in that note that he left behind for his son. How do you piece or try to piece a lot of this together?
Well, Neil, first of all, thanks for having me on this morning. And, I think as you first touched on the story, there's relief, there's grief, and there's despair in that community. And the despair is really kind of understanding what really happened. And it's not just what happened at the two venues where the shootings took place, but what happened before. Why weren't any tripwires in place if it turns out to be that he was under medical supervision or he gone in for treatment for some emotional medical issues back this past summer. But as far as investigators piecing this together, when these incidents occur, we sometimes look at it, from afar, and we start to try to piece this thing together as being, armchair pundits. But the reality is that they walk into something it's almost like this life and death game of Clue. Who is this person? Put them into focus, find out a bit more about them, and then try to understand, particularly in this case, what was he doing afterwards? Were there plans for him to try to escape? They didn't know that. And only as more things came about, and I believe it was probably that note combined with the cell phone, there were some other indications, I think, early yesterday that they were focusing their search on the community area and not saying that he's gone out of the state or he's tried to escape into some far distant location. So I think at that point they were focusing on putting divers in the water, thinking that perhaps he took his life down by that boat ramp, and then the search as it expanded, Neil, found him in this kind of, I think, a wooded trail area, not too far away from where he actually worked.
Indeed, with that recycling center from which he was fired, I believe a few weeks ago, was just a short walk away. I'm wondering if that had anything to do with this. So much we don't know, but how do they start piecing things together, or whether it was his intent to kill 18 people, whether some were just sort of collateral damage and he was targeting just a few? We have since learned that he used to go there with a girlfriend to both locations, the bowling alley and the bar. Maybe that had something to do with it. But again, it's a big unknown.
It's a big unknown, and what will happen is that as a result of any of these tragic incidents, actually one of the roles the FBI plays is that they bring in their behavioral analysis team. They study these cases. They try to piece together kind of the mindset of the individual. As you just mentioned, perhaps it was him being let go from his work, but combined maybe with either his mental condition, maybe medication that he may have been on, that all of a sudden he reacted, and he reacted out against maybe locations or even people who he knew perhaps felt maybe responsible for him losing his job or his life being in kind of a downward spiral. So it is something that they'll piece together, and they try to learn from these and try to be in some way a bit predictive when they're at least when the authorities then and the FBI is aware that somebody may be a potential threat, is try to put that person, again, better in focus so they maybe can intercede before something tragic like this happens.
You and I have chatted so often, Bill, after these type of tragedies. And we always sort of recount the red flags that were out there, the issues that were known. There's indications that Card was hearing voices, that he had anger management issues, that he had just been fired from his job and he was not happy about it. But we don't piece them together until well after the fact. But there is a pattern to this.
Yeah, certainly, Neil, as you just said, over the years, as we've looked at these cases, both as they're evolving and then even post the incidents, there seems to be some kind of pattern that someone somewhere along the way either thought, saw, or heard something that gave them concern, and either they didn't take the proper action, they didn't take any action, and these incidents unfold. It does kind of call into, what needs to be looked at. And in my view, we often hear kind of the lightning rod of, banning assault weapons or, trying to control the guns. To me, it really is this other side of it. It really is these, I think in Maine, for example, it's a yellow flag law, but in other states have red flag laws. It's really to make them much more comprehensive, making sure that there's due process. Certainly we have a very strong Second Amendment right in this country, and they need to be protected. But you need to make sure that people can report these incidents or these concerns to authorities and have those processes move very quickly, whether people shouldn't have access to weapons from the get-go, or should they have a weapon removed from them? Should they be suffering some mental or other issue that should prevent them from having, again, through due process? But I think, again, the focus often talks about limiting the number of bullets in a magazine or limiting the weapon. And I can just tell you from a personal standpoint, a number of years ago, there was a tragic shooting not too far away from where I am. And one of my neighbors was, in fact, one of the people who was shot and injured. But 6 people were killed on a railroad train here, 18 others, I think, injured. And that took place in 2 minutes with a handgun, with a semi-automatic, weapon. So we talk about the weapons, whether they, look more fearful or whether they can, shoot more. Sometimes that's not the issue as much as it's really the person and who has access to them. And in this case, there'd be a lot of reflection, a lot of kind of digging through and finding out what tripwires may have been missed, or if they weren't missed, why weren't they acted on?
I fully recognize the Second Amendment and its importance and its core in our country, but this is the 36th mass shooting we've seen this year, as you know, Bill, and I know there are some distinctions drawn between the guns and the people who shouldn't have their hands on those guns, and others between yellow flag warnings and red flag warnings. I guess a red flag warning would be such that authorities would come in and take all your weapons. That was not the case in Maine, I believe. So I wonder if we all have to get on the same page in this. I think most people would agree that those with serious mental issues shouldn't have them in the first place, or if they're exhibiting real stress, a guy hearing voices, anger management issues, that this then reaches a level at which authorities should intercede. Take your guns. I know the immediate knee-jerk fear is that don't touch my guns, but this isn't talking to people who have every right to use them, and the overwhelming majority of those who do. But this is a clear case of someone who might have gotten them under better circumstances, but the circumstances changed.
Yeah, and to that point, there are federal laws. If people have been committed, mentally committed to an institution for a period of time, shouldn't have access, and they shouldn't be able to purchase a weapon. We have, as you mentioned, red flag laws, yellow flag laws. We also have people who, as we know more recently in the news, about people who are on drugs should not have access to weapons. So there are all these various components that we speak about, but it appears as though they're never really kind of fully integrated and never really fully kind of robustly examined, put into practice. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And I'm not dismissing the fact that, we certainly have as I said, a due process and a right under the Second Amendment. But we need to be looking at these things very carefully, because all of these, as we start looking at them, have some nexus back to some, mental, either temporary mental, breakdown or issue, or something that had been preceding it that people either didn't want to report or didn't feel uncomfortable reporting a loved one or someone in the family or a coworker or a neighbor. But we need to kind of get beyond that and realize that this is the nexus of what these issues are. Is it's kind of getting out ahead of it and being able to react and be able to prevent it. And the only way you know that is when you're advised that somebody could be a threat, and for police authorities to act accordingly.
You've been great helping us here, Bill. If I indulge me and our viewers here, bring up to date, they are expecting a presser out of Maine right now. The details, some of which you have already heard by now, is that Robert Card and his body found near a river about 10 miles from Lewiston, Maine, where all of these killings occurred. They are self-inflicted gunshot wounds, we are told. We don't know at what time he might have taken his life, whether it was last night or before. We're also waiting to find out what might have been in that note he left for his son. They start pouring through that, any of his internet records, social media record, limited though we're told they are. So we're waiting on that. But one quick thing, Bill, as a former FBI investigator, we know the FBI was working with local police, state officials, in piecing together a lot of things. There's always a fear that this is wider. Real quickly, the thought that this was wider than it appeared.
In the sense that, Neil, it was wider, is that more people involved or other things? I think the
Exactly.
FBI's role Yeah, so the FBI's role in these cases, because they start off as being state crimes, capital offenses, murder offenses. And as a result, their responsibility is to come in and bring various resources to support local authorities.
All right.
And I think we're going to go to that
Bill,
news conference
thank you, Bill. I'm jumping on you, my friend. I apologize. Now,
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.